Morning, everyone. This is Michelle Marius. Welcome to the webinar. We're going to start now. It's 9:30, at least Jamaica time, 10:30 in the Eastern Caribbean. And I just want to thank everyone for coming on. We should have a full house, hopefully, but we will make a prompt start notwithstanding. I am the founder and the person who sends you the emails at least twice a week here at Project Calls. And I just want to thank everyone for coming on the call. We have with us representatives from the procurement team at the Caribbean Development Bank. So let me just introduce the speakers briefly. We have Doug Fraser, who is the head of procurement, and he is an experienced procurement specialist with over 20 years international experience in the field. Currently, he's the head of procurement at the CDB and is responsible for the procurement policy unit, which manages the bank's procurement policies, procedures, and documentation. And we have Joanna Pelez, who is a procurement officer at the bank, and she has been with the CDB for nearly 3 years, but comes with a wealth of international experience in procurement, including on behalf of donor agencies. So that's just my little intro. I want to just ensure that we maximize the time. I have set out at least, a maximum of an hour and a half for the session. I think that we should probably finish in just over an hour. Doug and Joanna will go through their presentation. I think that they will allow questions while they're delivering the presentation. I will let them share their modus operandi with us, and we will just take it from there. So thank you just once again for coming on the call, and I'm going to hand over to Doug and Joanna now.
Okay, thanks very much, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody through electronic means. Just happy that we have a space to be able to share this type of information with you all. As Michelle mentioned, we hope to be able to share with you a little bit about what the Caribbean Development Bank does in the region and the support to our borrowing member countries, and more specifically in terms of procurement and the opportunities that come through the implementation of our projects. Doug and I will walk you through the presentation. We'll introduce the bank for those that are not as familiar with the institution, and then we will dig in a little bit more into the our procurement framework, and more specifically in regards to the new procurement framework that was approved by our board of directors late last year. And then we will also like to share with you, given the current situation, some of the COVID-19 measures that that we have set up for countries to be able to utilize in terms of the procurement process, so that it also allows a bit more flexibility for the bidders, consultants that would like to participate in the different processes that are being carried out despite of this global pandemic. If you want to ask questions throughout the presentation, we're happy to address them as we go, because we'll probably be jumping between subjects. So I will be looking out for any hands that are raised, and I hope Michelle can help us too and call us out if we happen to miss any hands that are raised. But also feel free to submit questions via the chat, and we'll happy to address them at the end as well. So with I'm going to turn off my camera just for now in case, because our connection seems to be going on and off. And before I kick off, I think many of you are watching us from home. Although the bank is based in Barbados, we're still working from our homes. So I'm going to turn off the video just to help with the connection quality. But other than that, I think we shouldn't have any other issues. Okay. All right, so here we go. So our presentation is going to cover a little bit of an overview of our work. We're also going to talk about the new CDB procurement framework, and obviously from a private sector perspective, what are some of the key concepts that you would like to be familiar with when participating in a procurement process that's financed by the Caribbean Development Bank. And also we're going to speak about those COVID-19 procurement measures that I spoke about. Okay, so who is the Caribbean Development Bank? We are a member of the Multilateral Development Bank community. As you're familiar with other banks that are also operating in the region, World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and other banks around the globe, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the European Investment Bank. We're all part of this um, harmonized MDB group, and obviously our procurement policies are also harmonized and aligned with this other MDB. So we operate very similar to these other institutions that you may also be familiar with. But we are the only MDB that's solely serving the Caribbean region. So we take pride on knowing the region in a more specific way than other institutions do, and the history that we have in with working with the region. As the bank was established in 1969, it actually came into effect on 1970. So we're celebrating our 50-year anniversary this year. You might have seen some events and news and articles coming out in regards to the celebration and what the bank has been doing around that. Um, and it was established to contribute to the harmonious economic growth and development of member countries, which I will show you what is the different types of membership that we have in a little bit. So it will be members that are either states or territories of the Caribbean, or non-regional members that act as lending members that are part of the United Nations. As I mentioned, our office is based in Barbados. Our headquarters is based in Barbados with a satellite office in Haiti. So we have a total of 28 members. 19 of these members are what we call borrowing member countries. So these countries will be the countries where we operate and where we finance projects and regional programs. And then we have 9 non-borrower member countries, some of them within the region, such as Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, Canada, and then other non-regional members such as China, Germany, the UK, and Italy. Our purpose is to contribute to our borrowing member countries' economic growth and development. And obviously, our main drive is to promote regional economic cooperation and integration so that the region becomes stronger together. So that's pretty much our mission statement on a nutshell, and how we operate in the region. As you know, and because we're a bank, our main function is to encourage capital market development. But along with that work and the resources that we provide to the countries, we coordinate development programs, we mobilize financial resources for development, we finance projects and programs across the region, and by providing technical assistance. So beyond the capital investment, we provide technical assistance around the capital works, capacity building, improving services within the governments. So these are some of the main types of support that we provide. Also on policy advice around the different economic sectors, and we support regional integration, as I mentioned, through regional programs that we also oversee in the region. We have 2 types of lending as far as the different types of projects that we carry out go, and it's what we call the ordinary capital resources, which cover mainly capital works and projects. And then we have our special fund resources that are more concessional in the form of grants or loans, and also they're allocated to a specific number of countries that are depending on their development level. And you will know, normally our notices will speak about the type of resources that are being, that have been approved, and the size of investment. So normally the notices, procurement plans, country strategies will speak of these, of the type of investment that's being carried out for that particular project or in a particular country. What are the sectors that we work in? And this might be of your interest depending on what's the type of service that you provide and in which sector. We have a long-standing um, experience in working in the education sector, primary school throughout TVET programs. We also work in housing, agriculture, social infrastructure, governance, economic infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, airports. Right now, we're working on port developments in 2 countries. I think this is where we have been putting more of our focus on economic infrastructure. We obviously do a lot of work on water and sanitation as well in terms of capital works, but also capacity building. And in the energy sector, this is a sector that we have been exploring more and more because of the potential of the region, on renewable energy, energy efficiency, and obviously the traditional sources of energy and how to make them more efficient. We have a window for public-private partnerships as well, and we also work with financial intermediaries in the region, so more regional development banks to tackle more, that will be more of our private sector window. Okay, so let me go back. So that was in a nutshell what the bank does, what our work in the ground covers. But because we're procurement experts here, we're going to speak a little bit more in detail about our procurement framework. Who can participate on our different procurement opportunities, what you need to know, where to find information, and we really want to take this opportunity to share with you the new procurement framework that was approved by the board, as I mentioned, which took into account a lot of the experiences that we had had in supervising the projects up to today, allowing for understanding what the market is offering, the challenges of the private sector as well as of the countries in order to build.
I've been in it for a while and it's going on and people are talking.
Sorry. And obviously while achieving value for money. So we have 2 types of procurement opportunities. Our procurement opportunities cover 2 types of opportunities, what we call project procurement. And this is procurement that's undertaken by the recipients of CDB financing. So this will be one of our borrowing member countries through their ministries or any of their agencies, government agencies. And this represents the majority of our opportunities. For 2020, we expect our project's approval to be for about $500 million US. And then there's another procurement window.
People talking, I see from the chat, everybody talking and enjoying.
I think we have somebody that has connection issues. Can everybody hear me well? I hope.
I'm seeing the picture.
I can hear you.
Okay.
I can hear good.
Okay. I'll continue and see if we are able to identify the person that's having issues. So as I was mentioning, the other window for procurement opportunities is it's the procurement that's actually undertaken by CDB. So the main difference here is that the contractual relationship under project procurement relies with the recipient. What CDB does is just to provide an oversight supervisory role. But on this other window of procurement, where CDB undertakes the procurement, the contractual relationship is directly with CDB. And normally covers sector studies and research to inform the future interventions that we will be carrying out or improve operations in general. We also do a lot of studies to prepare anticipated programs and projects, obviously from early stages of the country strategies and sector studies onto more investment projects, more specific investment projects. And then within that procurement that's undertaken by CDB, we have a smaller window of corporate procurement that's for CDB's internal needs, which you might also find interesting as well in some instances. So just to understand a little bit what is the role that CDB plays within this whole procurement processes, and this graphic here concentrates on what we call project procurement. So as I mentioned, the recipient is responsible for carrying out the procurement process. So they procure suppliers, contractors, suppliers, and consultants, and manage that resulting contract. Oh, where did my card? Okay. And then they seek CDB's prior and post review. They seek what we call through non-objections to be able to move further into the procurement process onto contract award. And CDB provides that project supervision review at key stages of the procurement process, and subsequently disperse the funds for the particular contract that comes out of that process. And we will speak to you a little bit more in detail of what are those key stages that we talk about, depending on the type of procurement that we're carrying out. On the other hand, we have the contractors, suppliers, and consultants, which contractual relationship with the recipient directly, and the responsibilities to provide those goods, works, or services that are put forward in a bidding document, or a request for proposals, or purchasing order, whichever type of bidding document we're speaking about. And then here is a dotted line because according to our policy, according to our procurement framework, contractors, suppliers, and consultants have a window for escalating complaints to the bank. Normally, the complaints will be dealt with directly with the recipient, and they normally work these complaints in consultation with CDB, as informed by our procurement framework. But there is an instance to escalate complaints to CDB, but we will normally use this channel of communication always. So just this is for you to have the big picture out, or what are the different roles. Okay. So CDB procurement framework is consists of two sets of policies. We have our guidelines for procurement and the guidelines for selection and engagement of consultants, which apply to projects that were approved prior to November 1st, 2019. So this is something that you want to look when you're looking out for opportunities. You might want to clarify it if it's not clear within that particular notice which policies apply, and it will be according to the project approval date. And then our new framework, which was approved last year, will apply to projects that were approved on or after November 1st, 2019, and it covers it contains our procurement policy. It's our main procurement policy for goods, works, and consultancy services. So what we did here was merge all the information in one main document, all the types of procurement and the principles in one main document, as opposed to having two different sets of guidelines. And then the procurement procedures we draw on from the policy on the specific requirements, and it covers goods, works, non-consultancy services, and consultancy services. And this is what Doug is going to be speaking to you about in a minute. We're going to be concentrating on what this policy and procedures cover, which also draws on from these guidelines that we still have, that are still used in some of our older projects, but where the bank will be eventually moving on to using this new framework more and more. I don't know, let me see if we have any comments real quick. Do we monitor normal? Okay. Okay, I think there's no questions that's specific to the presentation, so I should be able to address some of the other things later. So I'll
Sorry,
hand it
excuse
over to.
me. Yes, there is a question. I didn't see where to raise hands. So,
Oh, okay. Yeah,
can I
Heidi,
ask
go
a
ahead.
question now?
Yeah, please go ahead.
All right. What I'm trying to find out is when you say projects that were approved prior to November 2019, you mean, so for example, we're looking at projects that, okay, for 2020, the notice may come up, the procurement notice may come up, but they would have been approved under some kind of, what I would say, when you made arrangements with, for example, the government or whatever, it was approved.
Correct.
Okay.
So
So the
we
notice
will
made
be.
coming up in 2020,
Mhm.
those were projects that were already.
That's a good question. So we will be guided by the day where the board of directors actually approve the project.
Okay.
Normally, once the project is approved, the country has to meet a set of conditions precedents, notices when sometimes there are multiple delays, or there are milestones that have to be met before a specific procurement notices go out because of the project plan, project implementation plan. So we will be guided by the day that the board will have approved the project. And there will be notices that will come out for the next couple of years during that implementation phase.
Okay, so how as a consultant, when I look at a consultancy notice, how would I know, well, this was?
Oh, so the procurement
So
plan.
to know which guidelines to apply, whether it's the before November 2019 or after.
Okay, so we normally post before, once a project is approved and we're ready to, and procurement is ready to start, we will publish the procurement plan for that project. And the procurement plan should have information of which are the policies that applied, if there are any waivers in terms of eligibility or the use of which policies. Sometimes there are instances we will, not to complicate it, but there are a limited number of instances where we will allow for the use of other guidelines that are not CDB guidelines. So I think the most accurate information, up-to-date information you will get from the procurement plan, which identifies the set of policies.
The notice wouldn't say anything about that.
The notice makes reference to the policies in the eligibility section. I don't, that's something, and that's feedback for us we can always adjust those templates.
Right,
So
because what I'm saying is it would be good if in the notice there was some indication of that, so that person's clear, okay, I'm looking at this project and right.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's good feedback. Some our notices have some text that refers to, but I don't think they all do standardly. So I think that's a good feedback for us because we're now working with these two sets of policies, and there are obviously some things that apply to the new one that were not covered on the older one. So thanks for that.
You're welcome.
Okay. So I'm going to hand it over to Doug. Sorry, Doug, do you want me to walk through the slides, or do you want me to stop sharing and then you share the presentation from there?
You can control the slides, that's fine. I'll just give you I'll let you know when I need to proceed to the next one.
All right.
I have one more question. Is it possible?
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Is it mandatory to have to be SIP certified to be able to apply for any procurement role within the CDB?
Oh, not necessarily. We normally there is a whole range of procurement opportunities in different sectors. So unless the terms of references require you to specifically have procurement knowledge, you won't necessarily need to be SIP certified. If we're talking about consultancy services for a study in education, obviously that they need but you will, and there is no really mandatory requirements on the knowledge of the policies unless the terms are for you to participate. But we encourage you to be familiar with the policies because it will allow you to be more successful throughout the process. These are the steps that you will be taking either way to participate in all of the procurement opportunities that are financed by CDB.
Thank you.
Just to add to that question, I think you were specifically interested in procurement roles. We certainly wouldn't expect it to be restricted to SIPs. I mean, if they were looking for professional qualifications, this is the procuring entity. We would expect them to also look at equivalent qualifications. So not just limited to one provider of qualifications.
Okay, thank you.
So from my side, I just wanted to say good morning to everybody.
Good morning.
As Michelle has said, I'm Doug Fraser, Head of Procurement at CDB. I'm very grateful for this opportunity that Michelle and Project Calls has provided. I think it's a great endeavor to try and spread a little bit more information, but also to hear your feedback. That's also very important for us, as Joanna's already mentioned. It's good to see some familiar names as well on the participants list. And just looking at some of the names I know, I think we may have a slight bent towards consultancy services, but if there's suppliers and contractors out there, please don't let me forget you. And I guess we're all getting quite used to these virtual meetings, presentations. But if people are having problems getting their questions out or hearing me or anything like that, please put it in the chat. Let us know. On my side, I've locked my kids up, locked all the pets up, so hopefully we won't be disturbed. And as was said earlier, please feel free to ask questions as we proceed, and we can also take questions at the end. I know Valerie Jenkinson has asked, she's actually got a concern about submitting proposals, and Valerie, maybe we could come back to the specific concerns and frustrations that you see from the consultancy services side at the end, and we can speak to those, because some points I may cover, particularly in the slide where I speak about what to do when things are not working. But as I said, it's important to hear your feedback. So I suggest we park that for now, and we will come back to that a little bit later. So Joanna has essentially set some of the foundations for what I'm going to speak to. She's spoken a little bit about who we are, what functions we seek to perform as a bank, and she's spoken a little bit about the pillars of the procurement process that our project procurement, that is the procurement undertaken by our recipients, follows. She also mentioned we have a new procurement framework which was approved last year. And on this slide, you can see broadly what the objective of that framework is. We're seeking to deliver value for money, the highest standards of integrity for our projects, and importantly, to deliver the intended development outcomes in a timely manner. Procurement is obviously a means to an end, and what we're looking at is the development outcomes. Joanna, could you move us forward a slide? Thank you. So just to say, what does the procurement framework that we're speaking to apply to? It applies to all of our loans and grants under which there is a procurement specific contracts for goods, works, and services. And that means if any of the contracts have a single dollar of CDB financing in the contracts, then it applies. What does it not apply to? It doesn't apply to contracts which we're not financing. So we often have a situation where under a particular project, we may be financing some contracts, but not others. It doesn't apply to what we refer to as policy-based loans. That is essentially budgetary support in return for policy reforms by governments. It doesn't apply to investments in equity, provision guarantees, or our own internal procurement. And we have some exceptions to our procurement framework through our disaster management strategy and operational guidelines. And this is essentially where we have natural disasters or situations such as we're having right now with COVID. What do we allow in terms of making the procurement more flexible? And I'll come back to that later. Just to say that we're actually looking at updating our disaster management strategy and operational guidelines at the moment, which would include the procurement provisions. And I think it's fair to say we're learning a lot from the COVID situation. If we can move forward a slide, Joanna, thank you. One of the big questions that the private sector is always keen to know is who is eligible to participate in the procurement process. So what are the rules of entry into procurement? So firstly, to say there is no restriction under the new framework on the origin and source of goods. So they can come from anywhere. We used to restrict goods in that they had to come from bank member countries. But given that we have a relatively small pool of countries and supply chains are increasingly international, this proved to be particularly problematic for many of our borrowing member countries. And in turn, it often led to an increase in pricing. So that's gone. We are saying that you need to be, as a bidder, unless our board provides a waiver otherwise, you need to come from an eligible member country. And we're going to speak a little bit more to that on the next slide. There are no, I'm not sure if we have the question. No, I don't think so. Okay, there are no restrictions on our private sector operations. Those are relatively limited at the moment, although we're reviewing exactly how we want to intervene in the private sector going forward. And I don't think it's any type of a state secret to say we're looking probably to do a lot more in the micro and small medium enterprise space. So that's opportunities both for consultancy and potentially for goods and works. We have some restrictions on state-owned enterprises as well. They have to be legally and financially autonomous to participate in the process. We have a special carve out on the consultancy side for educational institutions, such as universities, and for NGOs, where they have applicable expertise, and there's perhaps less providers in the private sector to provide what we're looking for. Joanna, we can move forward a slide again. So the key pillars, the key principles of the new framework are value for money, economy, efficiency, integrity, equality, and fairness and transparency. And this really is not a major departure from what we had before. It's more of an evolution. We've sought to harmonize these principles and also the broad approaches within the framework with other development banks working in the region to lower transaction costs. And fundamentally, we've tried to make the approach more flexible, more fit for purpose, if you will. There is certainly more of an emphasis on a full project life cycle from the procurement through the procurement lens. We're looking at much more at procurement planning and also at contract management. We can move forward another slide. So this slide just sets out what are the procurement methods, approaches allowed for under the framework. And certainly on the consultancy service side, it's pretty much as it was. There's a little bit more opportunity on the goods, works, and non-consultancy service side. We have slightly changed the methods. We've allowed for what was originally an international competitive bidding process, as well as an open regional competitive process, and where appropriate, a national process. Limited bidding, that is direct approach to providers, could be at the national level, the regional level, or the international level. Again, this is within the parameters of the eligibility that we spoke to earlier. So as I said, on the consultancy services, certainly for firms, we're still looking fundamentally, in most cases, to initially shortlist eligible providers and then seek proposals. For individuals, it's still very much a case of seeking expressions of interest, which are essentially CVs and cover letters, and selecting the best candidate. If we could move forward, please. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the cycle through which the procurement moves and the key milestones within those cycles. Certainly, things don't move as fast as they always should, and I will speak to some of the challenges within the various loans and grants a little bit later. But if all things being equal, this would be the type of cycle that we would like to see, or we believe should be attainable for goods and works. And you can see here, this cycle, this timeline is predicated on the assumption that there would be pre-qualification. And pre-qualification is typically 4 to 6 weeks, with an evaluation process of 3 to 4 weeks. This is done in country. The full bidding process is typically at least 6 weeks, and these are for international processes, I should say. For a national process or regional process, is likely to be more condensed. And the evaluation is really, frankly, where we have the biggest bottlenecks. Our borrowing member countries often have to pull members of their evaluating committee from across government, and they all have day jobs. And this is where we try to provide the support we can to our projects to expedite process, but it is, and I'm sure you will recognize from your own experiences, this is typically where we have challenges. So for a simple goods to works procurement, we'd expect that to be in the range of 4 weeks. Something far more complex, such as perhaps a design build procurement, or a very complicated goods requirement, perhaps IT systems or the like, it could take anything up to 12 weeks. And then we have the negotiations and award phase. I see there's a question on expressions of interest. I'll come to that in just a second, because we're moving now to the consultancy services. Joanna, if you could just jump forward a slide, thank you. Oh, we don't actually.
Yeah, we have, I think this slide was supposed to come after, so I'll go back to this one after you speak of consultancy
okay.
services.
If you could take me to the consultancy services timeline.
There.
Right. So this slide looks at the process for consultancy services for firms, and the question was asked whether there's a specific template for expressions of interest. There's a specific template in which the country will advertise the requirement in, but in terms of the submission from a consultant, there is not a standard template. I mean, within that, I would expect to see obviously relevant background on, if we're talking about companies, on the company, relevant experience, what sort of resources are available to the entity in question, and how you're responding to the specific criteria detailed in the request for expressions of interest. Now, as I said, if it's an individual we're speaking to, really it's more a case of tailoring a cover letter and a CV for the requirement in question. But coming to the timeline here for a firm for consultancy services, there is a minimum period of 14 days under which the consultants have an opportunity to respond. Now, what's interesting for consultancy services, unlike for goods and works for for the bidding stage or for consultancy services for the full proposal stage. The entity who is undertaking the procurement can accept a late expressions of interest, so long as they haven't finished their evaluation process. If it's for firms, then for most of the selection methods, excluding quality-based selection and consultants' qualifications, and obviously direct contracting, a short list of qualified consultants will be prepared. And that short list, between 3 and 6, will be issued a request for a proposal document and asked to prepare proposals. And that period for preparation would be at least 4 weeks. The technical and financial proposals will be submitted. And then there is a period of time within which those proposals will be valid. And the recipient should then complete their evaluation and all necessary negotiations within that validity period. As I said, that is the intended, that is the intention of what should happen within that validity period. It doesn't always happen.
Excuse me, Doug, before you go on, I have a question.
Sure.
It's related
Please.
to the question that was
Go ahead.
asked. It's related to the question that was asked by Valda Allen. All right, so in terms of the expression of interest format, well, I'm just saying that because what I'm saying is now that we're able to interface with you, CDB, I mean directly as a procurement, I'm just saying, wouldn't it be so something that you all can look at, be a good idea to maybe introduce a format for persons to submit their expressions of interest? Because what I'm saying is, I hear you saying you could use a cover letter and whatever in terms of individuals, but then, I mean, I just think maybe for consistency, it may be a good idea to introduce something, a particular format, so that everybody has this format and uses that format. It also helps in terms of when you all are like evaluating, you can evaluate like similarly. What I'm saying is across all expressions of interest. This is that in terms of the expression of interest, one of the things that I haven't been able to express or find somebody to express it to is the fact that I think it's quite frustrating when, you know, granted, we are consultants and we understand that we will not, everybody who expresses interest or submits a proposal will not be, you know, you'll not get through. But I think you all add to the frustration when I'm asked to pay in order to send my expression of interest or whatever, when we have, you know, more cost-effective means or modes of sending, you know, just an expression of interest, which is, you know, via the internet. So I'm still puzzled why in this day and age, CDB insists on us bailing out, you know, sending by FedEx, you know. I
can respond to that point perhaps first. We don't insist on hard copies at all, and our framework actually encourages electronic submissions. This is the decision that our borrowing member countries have to take. And I think the challenge actually is that it's a reflection of the state of the public procurement systems in many of the jurisdictions. I won't say which country, but we've been having a back and forward during COVID from one country in particular who was refusing to accept e-submissions despite the fact there were no couriers flying to their island. Obviously, we told them we couldn't support any procurement on that basis because only local consultants would be able to submit, and even they were not freely able to move around. So I think this is something that we need to work on with our countries outside of the individual projects. I mean, I spoke to policy-based lending earlier. that's separate from the traditional projects that we fund. But under those projects, we often have requirements for improvements in governance frameworks, public financial management, and procurement. And one of the things we have increasingly been looking at is e-procurement. And what's actually interesting for me is with COVID, we've seen, I'm aware of at least 6 or 7 countries in the Caribbean who have moved to e-procurement because they've had no choice. I think the stars have sort of aligned in many respects. They've been offered free software by a number of providers who are obviously looking for longer term business, but it provides a solution for those countries during COVID. And what I'm hoping is that many of those countries do not then go back to the traditional hard copy requirements. So certainly just to re-emphasize that that's not a CDB requirement, that is a country-driven requirement. And we, wherever possible, I mean, for all of our own procurement, we now use, wherever possible, we use e-submissions. I don't think, certainly the procurements I've been involved with in the bank, we haven't had hard submissions for quite some time. The other issue that you addressed, I mean, it was a very fair point, I thought. Expressions of interest. Sorry, somebody wanted to come in, I think. I'm not sure if there was somebody who wanted to comment on that.
No, I think somebody just inadvertently has their mic open. That's.
Oh, okay, okay. No problem. Okay, so to address the other issue, the expressions of interest. This has been discussed back and forward, and it's a fair point. The fundamental purpose of the expression of interest is to grasp who has the relevant experience and qualifications to undertake the assignment in question. Now, I think the thinking historically, and this is across not just CDB, this is across all the MDBs and quite a lot of the development players bilaterally, is that can be demonstrated in a number of different formats. Certainly, it makes it harder to evaluate. I will certainly agree with that. And it does make a like-for-like comparison a little bit more challenging. But none of the banks, this is globally, to my knowledge, have instigated a standard template for expressions of interest. That's not to say that there is merit in it, because there certainly is, and I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion. What I would say is when some of our agencies have felt it's appropriate, we have not objected to them attaching a template, questionnaire, forms to the expression of interest. And that has often been in more technical areas. So when we've had consultancy services required in IT, when we've had requirements in renewable energy and energy efficiency, some of the more complex areas where we need specific information to see whether people do or don't have experience or qualifications, we have done it. So I think this is a discussion that's going to continue, but I take your point. I think there was also a question in the box. This is also a point with considerable merit, talking about weighing qualifications and experience. And I think, again, I think there's some very fair points made here. Somebody may have very limited or no qualifications, but suitable experience. There's a very very apt comment there about Winston Churchill and Richard Branson. But sorry, Michelle, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I'm noting that there's a question about whether there's no restrictions on goods means also services by Eric McDonald. So
okay,
probably just to highlight the distinction that one makes between goods and services in the bank, and therefore whether or not when one says no restrictions on goods, does that automatically include services as well?
Thanks, Michelle. I'll come to that. But on the experience and qualifications, without trying to pass the buck completely, the criteria on the expressions of interest are established by the country. We do review those, and we quite often have long discussions with the countries as to whether we feel they're appropriate. And this issue does come up. So yes, I have seen cases where it's been completely inappropriate. But on the other hand, they do need some objective measures to inform the evaluation process. Now, that could be a trade-off between a certain level of experience as opposed to a qualification. I have no problem with that. From a bank perspective, we're not ourselves saying we're looking for certain qualifications or certain level of experience. This comes from the country itself. We review that, and we do push back regularly, but I think it is also a learning process with many of our borrowers. The question on goods and services.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to hog the thing, but one thing is I want to treat like with like. So before you move from that question, I wanted to ask the question because it's a question related to what you just spoke about.
Yes.
Okay. So in terms of the qualifications, one of the things I've found, so it's
just to be clear, we're talking about individuals here, not firms, are we?
Individuals.
Right.
Right. So so for example, yes, I understand that you need like you're saying, some objective criteria by which to judge persons. But my complaint also with the criteria that's sometimes written is that it doesn't take into consideration persons who are, I would say, continuous learners. Because, for example, if I have a graduate degree in something, but then I did work on my own in terms of getting certifications for other things, those things don't come across in the procurement notice. So that what I'm saying is, when I see the notice, for some things I'm saying to myself, I can do this, but the requirement, the qualification requirement would say, for example, a graduate degree in that, but I don't have a graduate degree in that. I have a certificate in this, but I take you, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I take your point completely, but I think you'll find for most of the, or many of the individual consultant roles that we have advertised, you will not find in the request for expression of interest a certain level, certain qualification or a level of experience. Sometimes there is, but in many cases it's left fairly broad and asks the individual consultant to demonstrate what they're bringing to the table broadly. So it all can be considered in the evaluation process. I think you more often see that minimum number of years and a certain level of experience. You more often see that in the requirement for team members within a consultancy firm. Now, the same argument obviously could be made for that.
But I'd just like to ask that discussion be opened up again, because what I'm saying, sometimes I think the procurement people just, you know, like boxing out people who could probably do, you understand this, but by being too specific, I find sometimes.
Yes. This is
like I say, I could do this, and I'm saying, but they have been boxed out because they say I don't have a degree in this or, you know. So I have my main degree, but what I'm saying is I've done other things. I'm not remain stagnant. So what I'm saying is it should, what I'm trying to say is that it should reward persons who have engaged in continuous professional development. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely, and this is one of the arguments for not going with a formalized template, because when countries start using templates, there is a very strong tendency for them to start writing into the relevant sections certain criteria. That's what we've seen in many cases when they come with these frameworks, forms. They often have almost a box ticking. I think somebody said earlier, tick in this form how many years you've done, whether you have or don't have. So I think, yeah, I take your point, and I think it is a conversation that needs to continue. Also, I think it picks up on the need for some further discussions, dialogue, training perhaps with some of our key borrowers in establishing the evaluation criteria. So I'm going to have to move on, but we can certainly wrap some of this up later on as well when we come to the conclusion. Now somebody's made a good point that apparently there is a standardized model for ADB for REOIs. I was not aware of that. Obviously, we don't enter the region with ADB, but none of the banks that I'm aware of within the Caribbean region have a standardized template. So we can certainly look at that, see what we could learn from what they're using. And I would say I do know that ADBs have big problems with quality of consultants as well. So it may be a response to that. So it'll be interesting to learn what the drivers were for that and how they've approached it. Somebody's asked about corporate procurement, whether there's any restrictions on the origin of goods and services for corporate procurement. Corporate procurement doesn't have the same board imposed restrictions on the origin and source of goods that we used to have on the project procurement side. So that is dealt with on a case-by-case basis. If they feel that the goods that they require can be sourced in the region, then in many cases they will restrict at least the advertisement to the region. But there's no board directive that it has to be from a member country. Just to pick up another question, there was a question on SOE independence. So this is a very tricky one. It's a good question. We are a little bit different to the other banks in that we have restrictions on SOEs beyond the borrowing member country. And this goes right back to the origins of the bank. From talking to colleagues who have been around a bit longer, I believe right from the early days, there was worries and concerns about state-owned players, particularly from outside the region, benefiting from unfair subsidies and practices, and as a result, damaging the regional contracting and consulting industry. So the requirements that we spoke to earlier, they have to be legally and financially autonomous. They are required. This is essentially a self-certification process. We ask them to declare that is the process. If we have doubts, which does sometimes happen, we investigate. We have, on a number of occasions, after having discussions with our clients, called on our legal and integrity department colleagues to look into some of the entities in question. If we find that they falsified the information and it's been done willfully, they can actually be sanctioned or suspended by the bank. And we have had cases where that's happened. So it's very difficult for us to start, for the client and for ourselves, to dig deeply into the financial legal records of some of these companies. Usually we ask them at least for registration documents and their financial accounts. But I think we have on a number of occasions tried to peel back the layers and follow the trail as far as we feasibly can. And I think we go farther than any of the other banks in that respect. So that's a difficult one. Oh, someone's kindly shared the resources for the IDB. Thank you for that.
Doug, do you want to touch on the goods and services question before we move on? Because I don't think we covered that one.
The goods and services. I'll come back to that. I just want to finish on the SOEs.
Oh, okay.
Yes, SOEs. So you're right. Many SOEs, particularly contractors in the market, are Chinese SOEs. We've had very few contracts with Chinese SOEs, mostly because they hadn't fulfilled the criteria under our guidelines. But as Ms. Simmons indicates, it would be interesting to look back at some of the discussions when China did join the bank. But it's not just China. There are other SOEs at play in the market. We have had cases. This is particularly where we have sources of financing which mean that the board have approved an extension of eligibility. So we've had perhaps untraditional countries coming in to bid on projects and other SOEs. So it's an interesting discussion. It's a very challenging one, and it's one that the other banks have also grappled with, but perhaps less so than us because we have more restrictions than the other banks. So yeah, they're good questions, and it's something that we have actively been tracking. And it was also when we had public consultations about the new procurement framework, this came up from both sides of the fence. Actually, we had some countries who were actually urging us to loosen up the SOE restrictions because they believe they get better value from money ultimately under their projects if they allowed in some of the SOEs who currently couldn't participate. And we had others, I suppose, more from the private sector associations who were more concerned about what the implications would be for them. So we've tried to find a balance, but it is an ongoing discussion. Coming back to Joanna's point on goods and services, yes, the eligibility has been completely removed for goods in terms of source and origin, so that is no longer a factor at all. For the actual contractors who perform works, the actual suppliers, the actual consultants, so these are the contracting entities, the contracting partners with what would typically be governments, they need to be eligible. And they need to be, just to explain a little bit more about what that means in practice, they need to be majority owned by member country interests. And that's as far as we can possibly determine. Of course, if they're publicly floated companies, that's very difficult. They need to have their headquarters in a member country. And we also go down to the layer of subcontractor and sub-consultant. So when we're looking at the breakdown on the financial bids, it's also checked whether the majority of the financial benefits are going to member country interests. We only go down now, under the new framework anyway, we only go down to the sub-consultant, subcontractors. We're not looking for the nationality of individuals within firms. So I think we covered quite a few issues there. Amber's asked a question about listing of projects in the pipeline. Amber, if you will let me park that, I'm just going to come back to that. There is some information I can share in a minute. So this is great. There's some really good questions coming in, and some of you have got some really good knowledge. So it's, sorry, someone's asked a question on procurement directly by CDB. I'm sorry, I'm only speaking to project procurement. This is procurement by the countries. Consultancy services by the bank, we're not covered by the guidelines that I spoke to before. So it will be on a case-by-case basis as to whether the consultancy services are available within the membership or not. And then a decision has to be made whether we go outside or not. Yeah, sorry, if there's any confusion, I'm really speaking in these slides to the project procurement. That is the procurement undertaken by recipients of our financing, which is the bulk of opportunities, probably 95%. So coming back to the
just to add to that, for reference, the specific procurement notice will indicate whether procurement is being carried out by the bank or the country, so as to give you some guidance.
Yeah,
that's it.
Thanks, Joanna. And there's, as I said, not a great deal of procurement we do directly, apart from the corporate procurement for our own needs. It's mostly things along the lines of sector studies, analysis or research that we need, particularly for our economics team. And there may be some pre-project work to prepare projects as well, but it's fairly limited. It's coming back to the.
I think you already cover individual consultants selection.
Right. Yes, I think we've dealt with this.
But there is another question in regards to eligibility. Should we address that one?
So, question from
Tamira.
If she's a sub. So if you're a sub-consultant, and you're from a non-member country, you are eligible to participate, as you say, as long as the majority of benefit goes to the member country. That's fine. Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, so your understanding is correct. So right, so we can move forward to the standard documents. We have a number of standard documents, and a lot of them are being updated right now to reflect the new framework. Essentially, we have a standard bidding document for goods, small works, which for us is anything under 10 million US. And over that, we have what we call a large works documents, which are drawing, utilizing the FIDIC forms of contract, if you're familiar with those, the Federation of International Consulting Engineers. We also have, on the consultancy side, we have standard requests for a proposal document, and we have a number of forms of contract which align with that document. That's being essentially lump sum or time-based forms of contract. We have a question from Dr. Eid on rosters. This is just going back a little bit. I'll deal with this now. This is just going back a little bit, I think, to the discussion on the bank's use of consultants where we contract in our own right. And he's correct that in some instances we do have rosters where we seek to identify suitable consultants we can draw down once they've been pre-cleared as necessary. So we have one which we use for procurement. There's one that they use for renewable energy efficiency. And I know that our economic infrastructure team is also looking at building a similar roster for certain technical services. I don't think that's, I know certain expressions were submitted for that. I think that's still a work in progress. And that may be what Dr. Ead's alluding to. So I don't know where that's got to, but I know that that's still a work in progress.
Doug, one question.
Just to add, there is also a roster on integrity and accountability that's
right.
open at the moment. If in case
right, that's
anybody has expertise around that one.
So that's out now, Joanna?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on our website under the procurement notices section.
Okay. So sorry, another question, I think.
Yes, concerning the roster. So I've submitted for like the rosters in the past and you just get absolutely no response. So you don't know whether, you're not sure whether it went through, whether somebody looked at it, whether the, like what's the, when you like in a roster, what's your process or procedure?
I can tell you what it should be. It doesn't necessarily mean it's working as it should be. So what should happen is, as you say, once you've submitted your application and the evaluation is complete, you should either hear that you've been successful and that you've been added, or that you've been unsuccessful. So if I can speak really about the procurement one because I've been directly involved with that. And under that roster, we sought to identify suitable expertise to support us in the countries. And as I said, we've negotiated a pool of consultants who can be called down, and the rest were informed that they were not successful.
I want to bring it to your attention because what I'm saying is that's sort of to the frustration. Somebody.
Sure. If you're not hearing,
just frustrated.
if you're not hearing, I'm going to come back to you in a couple of slides time. I'm going to tell you what remedies are available to you.
Okay, but I bring it to your attention because what I'm saying is you're speaking with us. So I'm actually very grateful for the opportunity, because what I'm saying is I thought that, you know, like y'all just seem to be like an entity out there. Nobody has response.
And that's not the way it should be. That's why these calls are important.
Right, exactly. So that we could bring those sorts of things to your attention for you to know, you know, that
because
to work with CDB, want to whatever, but then, you know, when you just get no response. I mean, imagine, I'm going to give an example. I think that CDB being a Caribbean institute, I'm supposed to feel warmer, safer, welcomed, courage, whatever, and I don't feel that. I imagine I would apply to FAO, I'll get through it some, not get through it some, but I always get a response from the FAO, and I can't about CDP. I just don't get no, you know, no response. You know, that's not saying that because it's just not good enough. And FAO is what I'm saying is based somewhere far out the Caribbean, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, I completely understand, and it shouldn't be that way. I mean, I mean, to be frank, I was in the private sector before. I've been on various rosters in the past, and I know the frustration, not just for rosters, but generally for procurement, when you put in a lot of time and effort and you don't get a response, at least to know where you stand. Now, within the bank, particularly when it's the bank is the contracting party. The individual division or unit is responsible for managing the process. They may come and see us for support, but they manage the process and they interface with the consultants. And I think Dr. Ead's question is actually related to a process that one of the economic infrastructure teams was undertaking, and I myself don't know where that's got to. So that's triggered an action for me as a result of this call, certainly for that particular roster, to find out where we are. And I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to come in a minute to what to do when you're not getting responses. Sherry Ann Simmons said she was on a roster, but she never heard anything again. I mean, of course, that is the problem as well. There's little point getting on a roster if you're not going to get any work. So there's different ways the rosters work. Some of them have mini competitions once you're on the roster to determine who will get a piece of work. These tend to be the bigger rosters, and those rosters may even be further divided up into sectors. Other rosters, it's more of a case where the consultants, particularly individuals, will be evaluated as each assignment arises to see who's the most appropriate. That should be written into the requirements. John, he's asking why he hasn't got a call on the procurement contract roster. That's a good question, John. A lot of the guys on the roster have been very busy, so I would have to ask the different departments and units who are calling down on the roster why that's the case. I can't give you a response here, but I will find out. I will get you.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Some really good points. Thanks. Joanna,
Yeah, Donna, because you know what it is that sometimes one person makes a comment, and you may think that that's just, you know, to the person, you know, unique to that person. But you notice, since making my comment, you notice how many people have been saying to you that they on rosters that not, you know. So I am telling you that it's not working. So that's something that you all need to raise.
Which roster are you specific? Which result? Just out of interest, which roster was it?
You have a roster for consultants, register of consultants.
No. Register of consultants is not a roster. That's a different.
Well, there was some other rosters, and what I'm saying is, when I just see the rosters, what I'm saying is I just ignore, and I mean, I would prefer to go somewhere else like FAO or whatever, because what I'm saying is there's absolutely no response. Nobody just responds. You don't hear anything. That's the
That's
thing.
noted. That's noted. And I take that very seriously, but I do need to know which rosters you're talking about, because certainly the REEE one, I'm aware, as far as I know, there was some good interaction with the consultants on that. The integrity one's happening now. The procurement one, certainly we at least had interaction with all of the consultants to tell them the outcome. If, as John says, they're not necessarily always getting the work that they hope for. So if you could look into your records and share which specific ones you're speaking to, that would be very helpful, because these are team, department, division specific. So the conversations I need to have will be driven by that information. And just to say, as I said a minute ago, the Register of Consultants is not a roster. That's a resource that is used by the bank to understand what expertise there is in different sectors. There's no legal contractual relationship with the bank and the people on the roster. Sorry, not roster, register. That register is usually used to share with the countries when they're looking for expertise in specific fields, just to make that very clear. And if you're getting any correspondence which does speak to that register as a roster, then please do let me know, because that's not correct. Someone was asking about the integrity call, so I'll ask Joanna while we're speaking. They can't see it, Joanna. Maybe you could share that information. I don't know if the date for applications has passed or it's just where it's positioned. So I'll ask Joanna to look at that. So questions, debriefings, complaints. I mean, you've been a great audience. You've been very vocal, and you've shared quite a few questions and issues with me, and I appreciate that. But in many cases, obviously, you don't have this opportunity. You're interacting essentially with the borrowing member country and the agency within that country who's executing the project. So what do you do if some of these frustrating situations arise? I mean, you've spoken to some of them. You don't get responses. You don't believe your questions have been answered. Well, in the first instance, because the contracting obligation sits, this is under project procurement, sits with the entity and country, you should direct your questions to them. I mean, if you come to us in the first instance, what we're actually going to do is just redirect your questions. But if you're not getting a suitable response, or you're not getting any response, you're always welcome to come to us. And we will, I can assure you, we will then speak to the recipient and ask them to respond appropriately, as they're required to do under the guidelines, the framework, and if we're talking about bidding documents, the bidding document in question. We know some of our agencies struggle with capacity. We know they have limited people and a lot of calls on their time. But where these issues arise, and when there are problems that folks such as yourself flag, these are things that we also think about when we're going into a new project and we're perhaps working with that agency again. If there are capacity constraints, if they are struggling in specific areas, how can we design the project differently? How can we build extra capacity into their team? If you're looking to make a complaint, again, in the first instance, that should be to the recipient. But then you are entitled to escalate that to the bank. If it's an issue related to integrity, a prohibited practice, then there's a specific reporting line on our website. And you will find revised complaints procedures within the overall procurement procedures. It's an annex to the procurement procedures on the website. This is for projects covered by the new framework. Debriefings. If you're unsuccessful, you are also entitled to a debriefing. We want entities who have not been successful to understand why, and to use that experience obviously to inform future submissions and engagements with that client, and more widely, I guess, on bank finance projects. Now, the client can choose whether they do that debriefing on a face-to-face basis. Well, I guess in the current circumstances, that's more likely to be a virtual meeting, or whether they wish to do that in writing. In many cases, we get complaints after a process has been completed, escalated to us at the bank, and then we discover there's been no request for debriefing. Someone's asked if debriefing is a standard procedure or it's by request. It's by request, so you're not automatically going to be invited into a debriefing session. That's something that you have to determine that you believe is of benefit to you, and then formally seek that from the recipient in question. John's asked a question as to what can and cannot be the subject of a complaint. And this is a very good question, I think. This is all set out in Annex 3 of our new procurement framework. It has to be in relation to the procurement that we're financing under a project. It has to relate to an interested party. So that's an actual or potential bidder, consultant. And that's including those who are seeking to be shortlisted. And there's much greater detail as to what falls into that category. And it's an issue, obviously, that needs to come before there's a contract in place. After there's a contract in place, there's contractual remedies which would govern that process. There's a very detailed step-by-step guidance as to how complaints should be made under the new framework, what information you as the complainant should include. The other thing to note is we have provided a provision in the new framework for standstill periods. That being, there is an opportunity both for consultancy services or for goods and works for the procuring entity to essentially confirm who they're intending to award the contract to, and to allow a period for complaints, objections to be made. And again, there is a standardized process for how that will be dealt with, but it allows for grievances to be dealt with before a contract award is actually made. Someone's asked, I think this is, sorry, just to finish with complaints. Yes, I think for particularly if you're dealing with a project under the new framework, I would urge you to have a look at that Annex 3 of the procedures on the guidelines to inform any communications with regards to complaints that you do make. So all the necessary information is included. So we're just going backwards a little bit, but Eric McDonald's asked about the rationale for global procurement for goods, but I think what you mean is not for the contracting entity, because it's not just consultancy services, it's all contracting parties have to come from a member country. And Eric, I concur with you on a purely procurement perspective, that the best thing to do from a value for money and transparency process will be to completely open up the procurement to all comers. However, this is also a political process. When countries join the bank, they expect to see some economic benefits for their private sector. So it's a balancing of, I guess, best procurement principles and some of the incentives for joining the bank. So it's also a political discussion. So this was put forward, this was broached, but ultimately our board were willing to open up goods, but they were not at this stage willing to open up eligibility on all contracting parties. And we're not completely out of step with some of the other banks. So you'll find, for example, IDB have a far more restrictive eligibility criteria than we do. Now, true, they have a wider pool of players, but they still restrict goods, and they have also a wider restriction criteria for parties. So it's an interesting discussion. It was also a very difficult discussion, I will say, which took over a year. But we made, I believe, as much headway as we could in the current environment. Joanna.
Yes, there is another question about standstill period and how it works. I don't know if you want to address that while we're speaking about complaints.
This is the last question.
Sure. Yeah, the very last. And just to resonate on the comments from Lucila and Haiti, we do have a requirement as per our policy that there is communications and notices throughout the procurement process on whether you have been successful in each one of the milestones or steps. So I think that will also be, if you're not getting that feedback from the countries, I think that's something that we also want to hear about, because it is a requirement per our policy that they communicate with successful and unsuccessful bidders alike throughout the process.
Actually, I think the #1 complaint that we get at the bank is from consultants who submitted expressions of interest and were not informed that they had been unsuccessful and that the process had moved forward. This is something we try to keep hammering home with our clients, but it is, I will admit, an ongoing problem. Cheryl Ann Simmons has asked a little bit more about the standstill. So just to say there is quite a lot of detail in the procedures, which actually maps out the process, the time frame, the milestones. But what it essentially means is if you are a bidder, the evaluation process will conclude and you will get a letter from the procuring entity, and this is before contract award, informing you who they intend to award a contract to. They will also inform you of the basis of that decision, and they will provide a mechanism, a route for you to raise objections or complaints. There is a stated period of time of, I believe it's 10 working days for you to actually to take action. If it's outside of that period, then it will not prevent the award of the contract. If there is a complaint made within a standstill period, then the standstill period can be extended for an appropriate period to deal with that complaint. It's an interesting one. I think we have. I think we actually have a colleague from Trinidad, Ms. Brown. I don't know if you have the standstill period under your framework in Trinidad, but just to say that the standstill period under our framework is optional. We're not enforcing it at the moment. This is really, we think it's great practice, and we think it's the way to go, but at this point, it's an optional measure. But I don't know if you're able to share how it works in Trinidad.
Hello, Mr. Fraser. Good afternoon, everyone. In
Good afternoon.
Trinidad and Tobago, we will actually be implementing the standstill period under the new procurement regime that has not yet been fully proclaimed. But we have written guidelines in that regard, and we are ready to implement.
Wonderful. I mean, I think our thinking was as more countries probably at a national level move to standstill periods, we would expect to see a greater uptake of the use of standstill periods in our projects. I mean, some countries during the consultation process for the new framework said to us they were nervous about bidders trying to frustrate the award of contract by making repeated complaints. Now that it certainly can prolong the period before contract award, but it does provide for a legitimate avenue for recourse before the contract's awarded. Okay. So someone's asked, sorry, where they can find the new procurement framework. Joanna, perhaps in a minute, you could actually pull up the CDB website and demonstrate how to find the relevant section for the guidelines and the new procurement framework.
Sure, yeah, we have a slide on that, so I will
Oh, we do?
touch on that.
Okay. Way ahead of me. Right, so we have some recommendations here. Now, a lot of this, I think I'll be preaching to the converted, but a few sort of high-level recommendations from our side. Research and focus where you have a competitive advantage. We do have particularly on the consultancy side, we do have a number of firms who seem to bid for everything and win very little. Positioning early is absolutely key. And I think this goes back to one of the questions perhaps that was asked earlier as to where you could obtain information outside of the formal procurement notices on upcoming opportunities. And I'm going to ask Joanna if she could speak to that in just a minute. Familiarizing yourself with the procurement procedures and documents, we've spoken to that extensively. We do have new standard documents coming, as I've said, some of those are up already. I think the request for proposal is up, but you will not find substantive changes in that document. It's really more orientated around eligibility and integrity issues. We have made some other changes. Seeking clarifications during the bidding process. So many times we get complaints that consultants are not happy with the terms of reference. They think they don't provide the necessary information, they conflict, or from bidders who feel that the specifications are, again, unclear or substandard. But we find that they actually have not raised a clarification during the bidding process. Seeking debriefings, we've already spoken to that, and we've also spoken to the process of alerting the recipient and CDB when you have concerns about the process. Joanna, could I ask you just to maybe provide a little bit more information to the participants on how to position early before the formal procurement process, and perhaps you could also say something about our new strategy document and some of the country plans.
Oh, sure, yes. So what the bank offers, and similar to what one of our participants share on the different resources, is that, and by requirement, by policy, our countries will normally develop country strategies. So I think that will be the earliest, one of the first steps to take in order to familiarizing yourself with what are some of the type of investments or sectors that that particular country is focusing on. CDB's institutional strategy, which was updated for 2020-2024, but I can also share a link to that as well. the general procurement notices, which list in general, a bit redundant, but what are the different services, goods, and works that will be procured under the project, and the specific procurement notices. The general procurement notice along with the procurement plans. So really doing that business intelligence work ahead of when the actual procurement notice is published will give you an advantage over other interested bidders that come in the game a bit late. I will say. I think that you know, if by the time you submit that expression of interest or bidding document, you have already been familiar with the project for the past few months. You can always reach out to the agency to request information at that stage that they can share with you in regards to the project in general. So that's also that we encourage you to do. Normally we share the contact information for the country agencies, and obviously if you're not getting an answer, we have our procurement mailbox that you can reach out to, and we will follow up on your request in terms of information at the early stages of a project or a particular procurement process as well.
No, just to add to that, we do have announcements also when the board approves new projects. These are quite bite-sized announcements that will come up on the website, speaking to what project's been approved and what the key components of that project are. We are working on a new bank-wide IT system, which I hope will make that information sharing a little bit easier in future. But once those projects are approved, as Joanna says, then there is a natural flow from there into a general procurement notice and a procurement plan, which captures most of the information.
So the idea, sorry, we wanted to share, I wanted to walk you through the website in a little bit, but I was just gonna leave that for the wrap-up slide. So if you will bear with us, once Doug finishes covering COVID measures, I will get back to it.
Yeah, just to pick up a couple of questions that have come in while we've been speaking. Somebody asked about technology transfer as an evaluation criteria. This, I think, I don't know if you are speaking here in the context of consultancy services, but there is a criteria which can be applied, which is a maximum of 10 points out of the total 100 for technology transfer in consultancy services. That's under the template. There's some questions about clarification periods being too far in advance of closure. I suppose the point that's being made here is that you haven't had sufficient time to review the content of the document to be able to respond on some of the issues that you find within. Yeah, so that's really, I think, a case of sensitizing our agencies to make sure they allow a suitable period of time for the process. And that is noted. Thank you. Okay. Some really good questions coming in. Joanna, can we move to the next slide? We wanted to say a little bit about COVID, and I'm surprised actually it hasn't come up on the questions and comments thus far. This has meant that we've had to provide some guidance and instructions to our clients, particularly those who are wedded to what somebody referred to earlier, being the sort of traditional paper-based system. We've been trying to make sure that as far as possible, procurement can continue. Actually, in many respects, it's a great opportunity for some of our clients to progress procurement because they don't have some of the day-to-day distractions that they might have normally. It's just a case of doing it within the framework of our procedures and their national systems, and having the technology to support it. The first thing we've tried to do is we tried to make sure that all of our ongoing processes, the clients are mindful of the additional time that's needed for the preparation of submissions. We've been trying to remind people that a lot of the bidders, the consultants themselves, their teams are scattered. They're not working in normal circumstances. They don't have ready access to perhaps other parts of their organization that they normally would. So no more time is necessary. The requirement to provide original signed documents obviously needs to be looked at, and we need to look at what can be done electronically. We've had some very difficult discussions with some of our countries who have a direct conflict with what we can allow under our guidelines as to what they would practice under their national systems. And the receipt of the actual practical receipt of submissions, the need for electronic submissions. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm aware of, I think, 6 or 7 of our client countries who have actually adopted e-procurement systems for the first time. Others are using more makeshift means of upload tender boxes or email submissions. And what we're doing is on a case-by-case basis, speaking to them to ensure that we're comfortable with the integrity of the system that they're providing. We've also had electronic bid openings, proposal openings. Of course, this does allow benefits that weren't in place before. We can actually record these sessions, and it adds a layer of integrity that you wouldn't normally have. On the contract award execution side, well, we have a practical problem that a number of our projects have actually not been able to, at the individual contract level, move forward because of the restrictions within the countries in question. I mean, for example, here in Barbados, until recently, with the exception of a couple of projects, no construction was possible. Then we had the added problem that where we had supervising consultants for those projects who were international, unless their team were on the ground, we didn't have anybody to supervise the work and certify the payments. So real challenging situations. And we were looking at the numbers actually this morning as to what's moved over the last 4 to 6 weeks, and it hasn't been pretty at all. But things are starting to start up again. Not everywhere, and different projects have different challenges, but things are slowly, I think, starting to move. Of course, that could be set back again. We've looked at, for the contract award, coming back to the slide, the use of e-signatures, where this is allowable, and allowing more time for the submission of documentation. Certainly as a bank, we've actually fully adopted e-contracts, e-signatures for the first time, something I've been wanting to do since I've been at the bank. And I don't think we'll be going back. Now that it's in place, I think we'll be using that for the foreseeable. So we had a contract we placed with a consultant in our own right yesterday, and I was able to sign that contract sitting at home in my office, and within minutes she was able to countersign it, and we both had final copies of the contract thereafter. And for some of you, that I'm sure that's just normal everyday practice, but certainly dealing with some of the dealing with our own bureaucracy and with that of some of our countries, it is a major step forward. Just to say a little bit about force majeure. We've also been speaking to our suppliers, contractors, consultants about the force majeure, which has been in many cases been declared. In many cases, we found particularly contractors and consultants on civil works projects declaring force majeure, but not providing any supporting evidence of why in their situation force majeure applied, what they actually could and couldn't do. And also, more importantly, we've also been talking where force majeure is declared, the need to have a startup plan for restarting. of course, it's interesting for our large works projects because the FIDIC forms of contract don't actually treat a pandemic as a force majeure situation. So we've been looking at how that's treated because it's treated under other clauses within the contract. So there has been a lot of involvement also from legal, both here and within some of our recipient countries to interpret the contract conditions. I mean, it goes without saying that this is an unprecedented situation, but we need to build resilience into our processes. So if this or a similar situation reoccurs, we're ready. We can move forward a slide, I think, Joanna. Okay, I'm going to ask Joanna to pick up this slide and hopefully actually walk us through the relevant part of the CDB website.
Sure, thank you, Doug. So far it's been a really fruitful discussion, and like Doug said, we're happy to have such an active audience. But I think this is just a little bit of the kind of support that we can give you as you try to strengthen your opportunities and your success with by participating in our different finance processes. So we just wanted to leave you here with some of the information resources that we can offer on a regular basis. We obviously have a dedicated procurement section on our CDB website, which I will walk you through in a minute. And now that you have met the procurement policy unit, you can always reach out to us via the procurement mailbox as well. Obviously, as you know, recipients will be your first point of contact, but we're there to guide you through the process as needed. So let me see if this opens up in the same screen. Or I'll have to move it. Oh, okay, it's opening up in the other one. 1 second. Oh, I think I have to exit the presentation. Okay, here we go. Oh, sorry about that. I'm working with a laptop mouse, which is not as friendly as the other mouse. Here we go. All right. So this is our website, and under the menu you can access our procurement section under Work with Us. Before I move on to the procurement section, let me go back to the home site. Okay. If you scroll all the way down, you might be able to subscribe to receive the new project updates that Doug was speaking about when a new project is it's approved by the bank. If you sign up for the ROS and the different social media and also subscribe to the updates, to the news updates, you will be able to receive first-hand information on those new projects that are approved by the board. So this is where you can subscribe. Then under the procurement section, for those of you that are not familiar with it, we have a dedicated section for procurement, where we publish the general procurement notices that I spoke about, and then specific procurement notices. This is where you will find those specific business opportunities. And as you can see, we have a number of them that are open at the moment, and you can always search by country, theme, or the type of work that you do, whether it's consultancy, supply of goods, or works. Then go back one slide. We also publish contract awards as required by the policy, and the procurement plans can also be found here in a similar manner to the general procurement notice and specific notices. So you can always search by the name of the project, the country where you wish to work, and the sectors and teams. And the one section that I think you will find more interesting is our section for policies and resources. We have our, somebody asked where the new framework could be found, and this is where we have published documentation related to the new framework. As you will see, if you want to access the older framework, there is a link to it as well, as it still applies to some of our projects. But the actual document for the policy can be found on this link, and the procedures as well. And then if you scroll down, we also have disbursement guidelines, which are more related to payments that are made under those specific contracts. Guidance notes that we have been developing in relation to the framework itself, to the policies and procedures. I think you'll find useful the presentation that we delivered today, or at least a summary, a more condensed version of the presentation can also be found on our website when non-objection by CDB is required, which I think it will help you with setting up your timeline for your participation in the processes. And we will include further guidance notes on specific concepts and topics such as evaluation criteria, complaints, and other aspects of the framework that require further clarification. Also, something important to keep in mind is the procurement thresholds that we have for each country, which will give you a guidance on the type of the procurement method that is to be used, and whether competition is open at the international level, or at the regional level, or at the national level, and this will also guide the documents that are to be used. We also have all the templates that are that Doug mentioned are required in order to request when notices are published. So for the procurement plan, we have a standard template for the general procurement notice, and then for specific notices under consultancies and goods and works notices. As Doug mentioned, these templates are more for the publication of notices to request expressions of interest, or the request for or to invite bidders to submit bids. We do not have standard templates for the actual submission of these, unless you are at the standard request for proposal stage or bidding stage, and then you can you will have to follow up those standard templates. We are currently updating the section on the actual goods and works bidding documents, as we were recently reviewing, doing a last review, especially on the conditions of contracts. So this will be up here very soon, in the next week or two. And then we also have the standard form of agreements for when we work with UN agencies, but this will only apply for when the services of one of these specific UN agencies will be engaged. So this is pretty much your library for procurement documentation. And as I mentioned, if you're working with a project that was approved prior to November 1st, 2019, this is where you will go to access the same type of information. So the layout of the information is pretty much the same. It's only documents that apply to that previous set of guidelines.
Thanks, Jonah.
Sure, no problem. So just I know somebody mentioned the register of consultants. Although this is not a roster, you can also register here, and a lot of our project officers and countries request sometimes that we give them access to the list of consultants that have registered, so that they can invite them to participate in a specific assignments that are being put out for requests for expressions of interest, so registering to this list of consultants will put you out there in the eyes of those that are selecting, that are making the selections. But you'll obviously have to go through the normal selection process, but at least they can call down on your registration to invite you to participate in this particular request for expressions of interest. Yeah, Doug, I think you wanted to comment with something.
Yeah, I realize we're starting to get short on time, and I think
okay.
I think that's a reflection of the really good engagement participation we've had. I just wanted to pick up a couple of things in the the group chat, and we do apologize if we've missed any of the questions, because you guys have been very good at participating and asking questions. There was a question on couriers. I mean, as I said, we would like to move away from couriers completely in terms of submissions and move towards electronic submissions. I mean, that's really where we should be going. So it was a question about whether the time should be the time it's dispatched or the time it's received, but certainly the international best practice is the time of receipt. Yes, that is, you could argue that's disadvantaging slightly those outside the region, but I think really it's a case of we have to have that in hand on the submission date. We don't know what might happen to it otherwise. There's just to deal with a few other questions. The integrity roster that somebody asked about earlier, you'll see in the chat, it has expired, but I found a link to it. And as I mentioned earlier, if the shortlisting has, the evaluation process has not been completed, you can still put in your EOIs for that. You'll find the details on that link. Sorry, I'm just quickly scanning what else we've got. There's a question about partnering. We don't have a formal partnering system to sort of match companies or anything like that. I know IDB has something that they have tried. I don't know how successful it's been. Connect Americas, where the companies can actually interact. We have tried to use procurement fairs, where we try to bring companies physically and virtually together. And the events like this also help. And we really use those as a medium for the countries to speak about their opportunities and the companies to mix. We've done those in Barbados, Belize a couple of times, Bahamas, BVI, Jamaica. We were going to do one in Guyana this year, but given the current situation, I don't know whether that's going to be possible. So yeah, we don't directly try to matchmake, but we have done some engagement with the private sector to try and support that. Hugh Wilkinson said there was an outstanding question from Amber about early stage project information. Yeah, we don't have like the monthly operational summary. I know like the World Bank would have. As I said, really, we're looking to try and get the new IT system, which underpins the website, to provide some of that information. At the moment, the early engagement information, I think Joanna spoke to it, it's really coming from the post-board approvals. The idea eventually is to have all of the board papers redacted, published on the website. So after the board approves them, you will see the paper with all sensitive information removed as to what the project's about, what the components are. So that's to come. That's very much a work in progress, and we're just starting a new IT project. Quick I think it's a final question here, and I do apologize if I've missed anyone. How does one get on the roster? Well, they will be advertised in the normal fashion. A procurement notice will be published like the integrity one I just shared the link for, and you will submit in response to that, and then if successful, will be added to the roster under a contract. I'm going to take this as the final question. This is about consideration to consulting firms who are new to the Caribbean. Relevant experience. Well, I think although regional experience, of course, is valued and is important, often the primary driver in terms of the evaluation is the relevant experience, full stop, and qualifications. And if it's a case that there are national, local dynamics that you need to understand, that might be an opportunity to find a suitable partner to work with, or a member of your team who has knowledge of the country, sector, area in question. I'm going to have to wrap up. I mean, oh, sorry, one last question. I think you asked this a couple of times. Does the bank consider unsolicited project proposals? We essentially, our projects come from the governments. The governments are the ones who drive the applications. We have a very small private sector window, but that's generally through, that's for financing generally for national development banks. We have some calls for proposals under specific facilities, such as the EU facility for furthering the economic partnership agreement with the EU, and regional integration. We also have had facilities for community disaster preparedness, creative industries, and there's a couple of others. So the solicited proposals from the unsolicited proposals from the private sector tend to be very specific within certain facilities. Thank you for the, so I just want to thank everyone. You've really been fantastic. You've certainly kept us on our toes. And I think I said right from the outset, this is not, we don't see this as an opportunity for us just to speak about what the bank does in our procedures. It's an opportunity to hear from you. We want to know where things are not working, where things perhaps need to be looked at, and you've given us a number of suggestions today. So I really thank you for that. I also thank Michelle and Project Calls for putting this together. And if there was interest, I'll be very happy to do something further. We will also try to share with Michelle any procurement fairs that we have that might be in countries relevant to you. Perhaps we'll have some physical ones when the situation improves. And really keep an eye on the procurement site. We'll keep posting relevant information. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, thank you so much for those who stayed to the very end, because we've blown past the 90 minutes I had thought we would need. And I just thank you so much again to Doug Fraser and Joanna Pellas for joining us today, and really to shed some light on the new procurement framework, but also to answer so many of the questions that I think we, as consultants, service providers, contractors might have, and really not necessarily having an avenue to share it. So I am hoping that we may have a follow-up session soon, probably on a different topic with respect to the projects at the CDB. So stay tuned. I will definitely be sending around the emails once any arrangements have been finalized. So thank you again. I will be sending out the presentation, and I will eventually I've been recording the call, so I'm intending to also share that as well for those who may not have been able to hear, or at least those, for whatever reason, did not join us today. So thank you again, everyone, and take care.
Thank you, Michelle, and all the participants.